I would like to turn to a very interesting point you made much earlier, where you talked about your great interest in science. And I suppose I picked up directly through everything you've been saying, a strong interest in pursuing the forensics, if you like, of particular cases, and having an understanding of science, I suppose, in the early part of your life would have brought to bear, I would have thought, a very good eye for concentrating on the minutiae of particular cases. Do you have cases in particular? You talked about a water case just right at the very beginning of our interview where you brought those skills to bear.
Yes, well, this was a fascinating case. It occurred on the banks of the Severn River near Inverell, Gyra. And there was a tobacco farmer, had his tobacco farm on the river flats, and above him, on a very steep mountain range, was a grazier who had a beautiful, very large dam. And the dam had been designed by the Water Resources Commission. And there was a rainstorm 5 or 10 years after the dam had been built. And the dam collapsed and ruined the tobacco farmer's crop. So he sued everyone he could think of. Water Resources Commissioners, the designers, the owner of the farm at the time the dam collapsed, and the owner of the farm at the time the dam was built. And he called his expert witness first before he, the little Italian farmer, tobacco farmer, gave his evidence. And the evidence of the expert went on for almost a week. I had sitting behind me and instructing me, as you're allowed to have an expert in court, the expert who we were going to call a professor. I can't remember, but he was professor of water, whatever you call it, at the University of New South Wales.
Hydrology?
Hydrology at the University of New South Wales, and the great expert in Australia. And I'd had ample opportunity for conferences with him. I'd absorbed the principles. I had all the formulae worked out and so forth. And at the end of my last question cross-examination of the other side's expert was, well, if the dam was built, and the question was about 100 years or 1,000-year happenings. If the dam had been built in accordance with that formula, would you agree that it was proper? Yes, said the expert. And as I say, we also had evidence that this was the most phenomenal storm. We didn't have to call it because we didn't go into evidence. But I had witnesses from the farm and from the adjoining farms who'd been out in it and just seen the hillside sliding down. The water, the storm was so absolutely phenomenal. So, but yeah, that was probably one of my more interesting cross-examinations.
So what was the clincher that swung things for you?
The clincher that swung things for me was that we were able to, we had the documentation which proved how we designed this. The formulae we'd used to design the spillway and the wall, and the fact that this was on a river way out the back blocks, no houses below and no towns around about, so that what you had to design for, as I recall, I might be wrong, was a 1 in 1,000 flood, a year flood.
Fascinating. And then the farmer's case collapsed, yes. Obviously.
We also had evidence, may I add, that we never got this far, that he hadn't made a profit for the last 10 years before this happened, so that we really hadn't cost him anything.
So your interests in matters scientific and your legal skills in a sense, it became a very fortuitous thing because you were, for many years, a member of the committee of the Medico-Legal Society of New South Wales, and of course you were an office bearer as well. And that seems to me to be rather fortuitous, that you had these two-pronged kind of areas of interest and expertise, which I would imagine would have served you well for the Medico-Legal Board.
Yes, yes. Of course, I did my apprenticeship in workers' compensation cases, where one had to be, one developed a good knowledge of medicine, particularly orthopaedics and cardiology. The question, regular question, is whether effort caused the heart attack, whether the sore back was genuine or not, and that, of course, while doing the workers' comp cases, I also did personal injury cases. My father had a much more interesting case in that respect than I did. He was in a case called Hocking versus Bell at the end of the war, in which the surgeon was alleged. Dad appeared for the surgeon. The surgeon was alleged to have left the tube in the there was a drainage tube left in the neck of the patient, Mrs. Hocking, who he had removed the thyroid from, and it was alleged that at St Luke's Hospital, in taking out the drainage tube, he'd broken it off, and half of it had remained. And she'd been very sick for a couple of years, and then eventually 2 years later she had passed this funny-looking red piece of whatever it was per rectum. But unfortunately at the time, just as that happened, she looked down, the doorbell rang, it was the postman coming, and she pulled the chain. So Exhibit A wasn't in existence. Well, this case was tried 5 times. Juries each time found in favour of the plaintiff. Courts of Appeal set it aside. Eventually it went to the Privy Council, and Dad lost before the Privy Council. The principle being that if there is any evidence whatsoever of negligence, then the jury verdict must stand. But the interesting thing was that in his preparation for that case, he went to Prince Alfred Hospital and actually watched the performance of thyroidectomies.
Did you do similar things to go and observe doctors performing operations and the like?
No, I didn't. I don't think I've ever done so.
It would give the first-hand experience of exactly how these procedures are carried out. There was, for quite a while, a spate of cases involving repetitive strain injury. Did you have much to do with any of those?
Had a lot. I had to do with them with court reporters. I appeared in half a dozen in which, for the defendant, where the court reporters were complaining of this. We also, although I didn't ever appear in them, we also had a lot of them in relation to the Sydney Symphony Orchestra, and you had them in Melbourne too, I know. I must say, and I think I won every one of them that I had for the court reporting branch. I don't believe that you can have RSI. I think you can have something anyway very like it, but their cases weren't strong. There was inconsistencies between the reporting and so forth.
So in other words, there's troubles establishing the chain between cause and effect.
Yes, exactly.
And that's where those cases ultimately founded. Can you speak a little bit about it, during your time sitting on the Medico-Legal Society? I believe there were interesting and rather sad cases of doctors who are no longer competent to practice.
Not the Medico-Legal Society. I was sitting as chairman of the Medicare Participation Review Committee.
Yes, sorry, I should correct. Yes, that's right.
Certainly. I've never really done the statistics, but I think there are a couple of statistics that are very interesting. First of all, bearing in mind the proportion of doctors that are trained in Australia and have been trained overseas, the number of doctors who got into trouble with Medicare who were trained overseas, much more than they ought to have been. And likewise, the number of doctors who got into trouble with Medicare who had a screw loose somewhere was much more than there ought to have been.
Why was that?
Because we didn't have any proper system of recognising them, because their confreres wouldn't bring it to anyone's attention, even their own attention.
But that could have endangered people.
Of course it could, yeah.
And did, I assume?
Yes, yeah.
With the case of the overseas doctors, though, it might have just come down to simply not knowing enough or understanding the system?
It certainly did. To an extent, I think, however, two other things, I think. One, they weren't doing financially as well as the ones who'd been trained here, so they may have had more temptation. But two, and I think more important, the ideas of many from Asia, and I include China, the Indo-Chinese side, as to what's fair with the government and government money is a bit different from ours. But I don't want to disagree with what you first said. A lot of it was lack of training. We still have no proper system of training of giving doctors any idea about how to go on, about what their obligations are about Medicare.
Did you argue at any stage for how this could be improved or rectified?
I made suggestions in several decisions, complaining about the lack of teaching, and comparing it with the way in which the optometrists did it. They do get teaching, but it didn't ever get very far.
What about the Medico-Legal Society? Could they have pushed along some of your suggestions?
Oh, no, I don't think that. No, well, I was well beyond the Medico-Legal Society by the time that happened.
So this is all still in abeyance? These sorts of questions and issues that you're raising?
Yeah, I don't know how much. I don't know how much Medicare problem, how much Medifraud's going on at the moment. That's a very loose term, Medifraud, but you know what I mean. And I haven't had anything to do with it for 4 years.